So today we're going through like my lecture. We're going to basically the design process. So I want to talk about the design process, what we do in WTA, and just kind of like a few of the ideas that are important to us. So I think who we are is, as a studio, we like to talk about social activism. Right? So in many ways, we have a certain activist principle or ideas or agenda in terms of what we do. And basically it's about trying to understand what an architect's role in society is. And this is kind of like evident in when we did the emergency quarantine facilities back in 2020. At that time, the world was going nuts. In the Philippines, all the hospitals were filling up. And basically it's like, the image that you see everywhere, you see the news flashes and everything. But then, then you get requests from donor to donate, to make these like acrylic boxes, face shields, whatever, sanitation tents, if you may. But as architects, it started to get us thinking like, we're architects. We were supposed to be building things, not making acrylic boxes and everything like that, right? And if you think about the pandemic, even now, the only way you really can kind of like prevent it, or fight against it is to isolate, right? To isolate, stay away. But if you look at a lot of our communities, a big part of the city, it's just not possible for many people because some people live 6 persons to a room, they have to take turns sleeping, and I think it's with that understanding, of the situation we are in the Philippines, in Metro Manila, that we have to understand how architects, how we can play a role. And for us, the way we can do this is by augmenting, the capacity of our hospitals, right? By building more rooms immediately, right? So it's an emergency response. And so pretty quickly, I think we had our first discussions around March 24th. And by March 28th, we were building the first facility. And so by April 1st, we were able to deliver the first one. So that's basically like, the idea was in 3 to 5 days, we were able to finish one of these facilities. Right? And these facilities were not the centralized government facilities. Our idea was to make them local, to augment the local hospitals because these hospitals, they're near, they're familiar. When you're sick, the first place you go to is the local hospital. So it's not a strange place in the middle of nowhere, especially if you're not a very mobile person. If you're someone who doesn't have access to transportation, especially at that time, you don't want to go somewhere you don't know how to come back from. Right? And so you remove this element of fear by augmenting the hospitals. But how do we do this, right? So at that time, we just finished this pavilion in Intramuros, and we were saying that, we're able to come up with, the idea was like, how can we do architecture without a lot of drawings, without documentation? And so we said that with maybe like 3 simple drawings, we can build these facilities, right? And the way we do that is by making it pretty much modular, by making it pretty simple. It's about, it's about the skin, the structure, and then of course the strategy and the scale of it. How do you do it, right? So in basically like 5 days, you're able to kind of like quickly, build up this facility. And the main concepts there was like, we removed this idea of like trying to make it pretty or nice, but try to focus on the ideas of speed and scalability. Right? And how you can achieve speed and scalability, especially at that point in time, is by using wood and plastic. Everywhere you go in our archipelago, when you look at the trash, it's either wood or plastic. And so these are materials that are available everywhere. These are materials that everyone is familiar with. You don't need special tools or equipment. It's easy, to use them, and they're very forgiving. If you make a mistake, you cut out another piece, then you put them up. And so these were the 2 ideas that largely led to this project. And how we did this was basically we laid out, we asked for shipping pallets, we put up the frames, we put on the skin, the partitions, the finishes, and then on the 5th day you finish it by installing the finishing off the electrical, the plumbing, and everything. And in many of the facilities we put up, actually in the 5th day or the 6th day, right after we leave them, they start using it. So it's a very quick turnover. Right? And one of the things that really matters about these facilities was that I think for a lot of the workers especially, this was basically the first time, that they're actually building something that's not for, let's say, a rich person's house, or a commercial project, but it's actually something that benefits everyone in the community. And in many ways, we actually learn and develop, how we build these facilities from the people who actually build them. They're the ones who actually were teaching us how to build them faster, how to make it quicker. And so, it's a very good role that architects can, play in our communities, being the fact that we are used to collaborate. We're used to bringing different people together. We're used to like working on different typologies, so we know, people's different perspectives and views. And also we're like, we're connected with all our vendors, and that's why it's important to maintain these relationships with our vendors, because then we can, at that time there were no stores, everything was closed. The only places were, we had to ask them to open their, their warehouses, their facilities for us to be able to use, right? So we design, we build, we share ideas, and we bring people together. And by doing so, we were able to kind of like quickly come up with about 75 facilities. I think by the time that the government started building their facilities in June, we had about 75 of these facilities up, all over Greater Metro Manila. But another thing about this idea was the idea that, I think, and people in this office, we all know that we're not very precious, about our ideas or our drawings. The idea that you should be able to share, ideas openly. And so by making these designs open source, by allowing access to everyone who needs access, and even setting up like a support group on Viber and everything, we were able to, help out our friends in Cebu, different islands, Davao. I think there was one in Tawi-Tawi. We're able to share these ideas and let them build. And this just shows how easy, and the legibility, of this idea, that it can translate across, so many of our islands. And, even our friends in Singapore, they built them in Singapore. And this would probably be like one of the first times where we actually did something that Singapore copied from us, right? And so I feel like we are idea generators, we are innovators. I would think that engineers would probably be able to build much better than architects, right? If you want to build the most efficient, the best building, maybe they would know better. Maybe some architects are also good, but maybe the engineers know best. But when you need something new, right? When humanity has to progress from, let's say, living in a cave to a nipa hut, to where we are right now in our cities and metropolis, you need ideas, right? You need to keep changing, to keep improving. And so that's where architects come in. That's our role in society. We need to constantly imagine how we live, not just individually, but also together. And so we need to innovate ideas. And so what we do is we try to develop this culture of ideas. I think one of the important things that set us apart as a studio is that we have certain, design ideas. And it kind of like, goes through all or most of our projects. It's almost like having a cheat code, right? And so we always talk about social architecture. And the three things about social architecture, the three principles we talk about is, one is social intimacy. We want to make spaces that are hyper-local, that are convenient. And this largely stems from the influence of our barangays, which are everywhere in our country, chapels and parishes in the whole country also. So the two biggest institutions in our country have learned that to be able to reach out or connect to the people, they have to be everywhere. Right? And so what we propose is we should also reimagine our institutions this way. What if our museums can be part of our everyday lives also? It's almost like the difference between our desktop computers and our mobile phones, making it immediately accessible, right? And making it part of your whole day. And the next principle we talk about is the idea about freedom of movement. A lot of our architecture, or a lot of our spaces and public spaces, even in the Philippines, this is the Mehan Gardens, they're always walled off, they're fenced off from everyone. We always have a dumb security guard standing around trying to keep people away from most places in this country. And what this means is that the people who actually need access to these institutions, these public spaces the most, they're the ones barred from them, right? Sometimes they don't have the proper clothes, they don't have the proper attire, maybe you don't have the proper identification, you're wearing slippers, you didn't take a bath, you're too dirty. So, a lot of these things that prevent us from actually making our social and public spaces truly public. And so when we were faced with this project to design the stadium in Ilocos, our first question was like, most stadiums, they end up being white elephants. And I think until this day, most of the stadiums in our country are white elephants. Because Filipinos don't really play football except for Arvid. And so, that's a big challenge. So, and when we were drawing the section, this building, we said like, what if this section here is actually the main design statement that we actually open up, the entire stadium and allow it to be an extension of the park that is right across the street, right? So this is what we came up with. It's a very simple geometric form, clean, and yet what we've done is we've allowed it to become a stadium park instead of just a stadium. It's a fitness area, it's a place that's open, and it becomes an extension. It's almost like an urban living room or an urban social space. And by using, we tried to reimagine how we can come up with, something that would, if we all have our images of the, international stadiums, everywhere that have billion-dollar budgets, but we thought to ourselves how we can come up with this like more attractive, or affordable pattern. And so we used this idea of PVC sheets, right? And most of the houses, not just in Ilocos but everywhere in the Philippines, we use metal tin roofs, right? And so by using this idea of like, okay, this is a very vernacular material, but in terms of like we're using PVC sheets instead, we can come up with this like interesting skin that allows us to create this kind of like very simple geometric form. So yeah, so it becomes a place of celebration. It becomes a place that's open to everyone. But largely, it talks about this idea that architecture should not discriminate. We always talk about accessibility as architects. That's always a favorite topic. But a lot of our places are not accessible to everyone. And it discriminates against those without the proper means or proper income. It discriminates against people who actually don't have the time to go out of their way. For us like you guys, you spend the whole day at work. You don't have the time to actually go visit a museum, or such spaces. And the idea is how we can make these public spaces or public places part of our daily lives. The next principle is about social scale or about connecting people. Well, this project is the River Lane. So the whole of Metro Manila does not have a single pedestrian bridge right now. So we wanted to be able to build this bridge. In fact, this bridge was supposed to be in Makati before, and it got moved around. Eventually, it ended up in Manila. But when you were doing this, one of the things that struck me was that, Filipinos, we've forgotten, or Manileños, we've forgotten what it means to walk across the Pasig River. Right? Always, when you cross the Pasig, you're taking a jeepney, you're driving your car, maybe you're taking a tricycle or something. But we rarely walk across the river. Even the new bridges being built, they have a sidewalk, but they don't have terminations. And it's not the nicest thing to be walking across a bridge where there are cars, buzzing by. So we said we wanted to reintroduce this idea of that, it's a very short walk across the Pasig. You can just walk across it, right? So how we can do this is by making the bridge itself a destination. Right? So the bridge is a connecting space. It connects two sides of the river. But it also serves as a hub, right? Any bridge is a hub because it's a connection point that brings two sides of the river together. So it is a place where two communities meet, or even more. And we were harkening back to this idea about the bridges, the old bridges in the Ponte Vecchio, in Persia and everywhere, where you actually have program on the bridges. You have shops there, like the Rialto in Venice and everything. So you have shops along the bridge, right? So there's program, there's activity on the bridge. So we wanted to introduce spaces wherein we can actually have events and activities on the bridge itself, because we wanted to be able to celebrate the river this way. By bringing attention to the bridge, you're also bringing attention back to the plight of the river. And so our idea was that to get people more used to this by creating a series of activities, a series of programs, and making the bridge not just a crossing point, but a connecting element for both sides of the river. And in this way, the next principle is that architecture should help build our communities. So what does this all mean, right? Doing social architecture, these ideas. What it means is that it helps us in our design process. Right? It makes the design process so much easier. This project was something I sketched, I think with Justin in like, 10 minutes or something, right? Yeah. Or half an hour most.
On a mat.
Yeah, on a mat. Right? This, we don't even have the drawing for this because it was in a restaurant's dining mat or something. But since you already have, this like social architecture idea informing what you do, right? You have the basic principles. You already always have like you're already half the way there. Because you have this whole agenda that's helping you, that has gone through a series of iterations, and now it's just how do you adapt this idea to this particular project. And so quickly, I think Job did this. It was quickly adopted. Wherein, okay, this is the form of the project, but then we knew that we wanted to make, this open. We knew we wanted it to make a place where people can actually walk through. This is a market on this side, and of course, it fits our idea about rethinking typology, trying to adapt typology to new means. So, for example, this is an arena, but this is also like a healthcare facility. It's also government offices. It's also a market on this side. So basically, it's a complex combination of different programs. And this was done pretty quickly in a week. And I think by Friday, we're supposed to be submitting the SD for this already. So in like 2 or 3 weeks, you're done. So, that's a shortcut, right? Because the hardest part is actually coming up with the idea. I always believe that you should be able to do the drawings in a few days. Right? And that's why you need to be better at what you do, whether it's like rendering or technical CAD work or BIM or whatever new, and maybe next time it's AI. But the actual documentation of the project should not be the bulk, of your work. When you're doing details, when you're doing drawing details, you're doing the details to make the drawings better, to make the place better. Not because you just have to submit a certain number of window sections or whatever, but because you want to make something that works. And that's where architecture comes in. Right? So the fact that we're spending probably such a big bulk of our time doing documentation, I think it's not a good path towards the future, especially when everything becomes more automated. Things, BIM, you can just imagine BIM and ChatGPT connecting, and what happens then, right? So the architecture that matters really is a design aspect. That's where the hand of the architect comes in. That's the human intervention. And we do this by designing with specificity. Right? So we have to have this like very structured way of trying to come up with new ideas. Right? We follow certain steps, and each project that you do is almost like an iteration of the whole studio's body of work. So you keep improving as a studio because your designs, your projects, they keep getting better. So for example, this was something we did, Justin's project. This was for the City Hall of Manila. So, it takes in different elements, put in together, but there's a very strong, almost like this datum, where you have this piazza in the middle. So the last book we did, which should be superseded by now, was about context and intent. So these are the two things that make your project speak about specificity. Right? So always you work on the context, you work on research. So what creates context, right? The first thing is people, right? Social spaces, it's about people, it's about us. And that's really what the urban condition means. So this was a project in Balanga, and the idea was that the whole of Balanga, if you look at the city, it exists around the plaza, and that's the pride and joy of the people of Balanga, was this plaza in the middle where they have this like old Spanish or Art Deco buildings, being built and even preserved or something. But I think from this idea that you have this plaza in the middle, and people can actually just go to the different maybe different government offices and everything. And instead of being, lining up and complaining, they can actually enjoy staying there in the plaza while they're waiting for their number to be called. So you make the visit to your city hall a positive experience, right? It becomes pasyalan, it becomes somewhere that you actually enjoy going to, instead of dreading this visit to this very Byzantine space, that confuses everyone almost in every visit. Right, so you walk by, you have the government facilities there. You apply for your, I don't know what you apply there. I don't even go to City Hall, but you apply for something, I guess that's why they do there. But basically the idea is that the piazza or the park space makes makes the whole city hall complex much more transparent, much more immediate, right? So they don't have like an office that opens up to a corridor. They have an office that opens up to this public piazza. So it makes it very public. The mayor's office is just above this, so you're actually walking under the mayor or something like that. So it creates this idea of immediacy, right? And also makes the plaza the social space that brings everyone together. The next idea is about history, right? It's about trying to find layers, trying to discover what the layers of a certain site is about. That creates context. So this project is for a project in Beijing. It's about the courtyard houses. And so we were looking at the different courtyards or the Shiho ones in Beijing, and we were trying to identify them and trying to reimagine what they can be. So we were saying, okay, it's about the laneways, it's about these like individual courtyards, but together, when you bring them together, they actually create like, a few houses together, they create their own courtyards, right? And these courtyards can have different functions. They can be residential courtyards, they can be commercial courtyards, they can be institutional ones, right? So our proposal was to connect, these reimagined courtyards and kind of like create this like laneway that is elevated. And so you develop a different perspective now, like you're watching over the entire Putongs. And so you have a different perspective of the city as you walk around. But the main idea is that you have this like commercial courtyards along the major axis. You have more private courtyards along the residential areas. You have these like institutional courtyards along the, like for example, a temple or along the public spaces. So now you create different variations of it. They're not all just the same courtyard, but you create a diversity of function in these courtyards. But largely, it's about trying to figure out what is there, what is in the site. These are all residential houses. There's like commercial alleyways or lanes. There's like institutional spaces where you have family clans, or like we call them the family associations or clan associations, right? And so you identify what's already existing on site. Another layer that we look at is geography. Many of our sites are pretty flat if you're looking at the city, but then again, you can also come up with urban geography or urban landscapes. But when you're faced with a site that, for example, this one that Arvin's worked on was like this idea of like trying to create a more resilient city for Catbalogan. So they wanted to move the city up, to the Sky City to make it a more resilient space. Trying to develop a new part, and because Catbalogan basically is filled up to its ears, right? So when you're building, along the sloping area or the sloping terrain, what you do is you actually fit the geography of the space, right? You create something that hugs the landscape, something that actually celebrates instead of like trying to fight the landscape by cutting and filling. Actually, one of the sad parts about this project was that they actually cut and fill a large part in the front already before we got in. But also, I think what we wanted to do with this project was we wanted to ask the question of what it means. What's the difference between, let's say, the old city where you're living by the sea, and in Sky City where you're now living up in the hills or the mountains, right? We need to reimagine, how the lifestyle will be different. And the idea was that if before Catbalogan, the people, it's really about fishing, right? That's their main industry or main, job. Maybe if you're living now up in the mountains, it has to do with agroforestry or something like that. So how can we catalyze this with our project, that when we are faced with an opportunity to actually do this, can we bring together the community? Can we encourage people to actually come and kind of like reforest the mountains of Catbalogan or Samar? The sad thing about Samar is that they're doing kaingin, they're doing slash and burn farming just to plant kamote. And so it's a whole like, it doesn't make sense, even financially. So what we're trying to reintroduce, like we're trying to use this project as a catalyst for us to reclaim the mountains, because we were asking people there, even the old guys, they all said it had always been empty mountain tops. But I don't think so. I think it used to be forested. And I think we want to take that opportunity to use this project to push for a reforestation campaign for the new city. And that, I think that also talks about what the difference is when you're now living in sky cities, that you have to reimagine, what it means to be living there. How is it different? And how can we make this relevant to the people is by bringing them, by organizing them to start doing this, also making them part of it. Another element we talk about is the environment, and that's another layer. When we were working on this project, it's in Batangas. Most of our projects we start with a sketch, but one of the things you quickly identify is the existence of this forested strip that's along this creek that leads from the mountain to the river. And one of the things that we really pushed for was that why don't we retain this forested strip, right? What if we make this, forested space the main attraction instead of something you want to develop, you want to, remove or something, but retain it and make it the main feature and celebrate it actually by making it the main feature of this new city. So now we're creating a forest city. But what does it mean to build a forest city? It's not just you have raw land, but it means you should introduce people to this idea of living by the forest. You create insertion points, you create interaction points and points of interest that allow people to kind of slowly learn, how to live beside the forest, how to introduce them back to nature. And so you create almost like a landscape of activities, but all pointed towards this main feature of the development that in many ways, celebrates the existing site and the existing environment, of this new city. The second idea we talk about is intent, right? So you have context, right? This is what we found. We went to this site, we found all these things, they influence what we do, they help us design. But the other half is intent. Who are you as an architect, right? What is it that you want? Of course, I said we had this design culture that talks about social architecture, but every project of course is different, and every one of you is different. You all have your own ideas, you all have your own intentions, right? And that is something that you pour into your project. That is how you nudge it, a few degrees left, a few degrees right. Earlier I was talking to Neil, I was saying or Ford or someone, that we're all basically 99.99% the same anyway, probably even more. Right? But the 0.1% that you can nudge or change is really what makes you different from the person sitting beside you. Right? It's a very small difference, but it cascades into the things that we do. So some ideas that show our intent, is to disrupt. Right? To say that we cannot keep doing the same things and expect a different result or expect a better result. So our project, the bookstop, was actually our own initiative. It was a research initiative because I don't believe that every time you look at a brief for a library project, the question is, do people still enjoy reading books? Do they just use their phones and everything? I think people still read books, and people would love to read books. It's just that many people don't have the access to books or public libraries, right? So what we had to do was we wanted to develop this library and put it around the city, move it around the city, and compare. So every place we put it near, there's usually a nearby library. See why is it that the nearby library has no foot traffic basically, and how much books do we turn over each day. And every time we move this, it's always usually the same thing, right? We turn over about 100 books a day versus the nearby library which turns over about 5 books a day. And mind you, these were some of them are school libraries, university libraries and everything. So I think what we figured out was that the problem is not the platform, or the problem is not that people don't read books. It's actually the platform, right? It's the architecture of our libraries and how we think libraries exist. So people don't like, the libraries that we currently have. So we have to change that. We have to change that typology. So what we did with the bookstop was we made it more open. We made it almost like a campfire, where people can gather. So it becomes a gathering point. And even now, I think we still get so much, requests about the bookstop. And so that's, how you disrupt, how things are done. Another idea is about the hand of the architect, how we do sketches, I think. So I think a lot of our architecture, especially you guys, when you design with SketchUp, it's very evident, right? Because you're usually articulating a project, simply with the tools you have with SketchUp. Meaning it's about extrusions, it's about moving, this lodging spaces and forms. But I think when you're able to sketch, you're able to create a much more free-form way of designing. The example I always use is that when you're doing things in a computer, whether you're using CAD or whatever, you always end up with very simple arcs. Whereas if you use your hand, you can come up with a more complex curve, because you can have different radii, you have different segments and lengths, and now you have a more organic curve rather than doing it through a computer. And so I think being able to sketch is very important. And so when we were doing this like small chapel in somewhere, it's in Samar. It's like a small fishing village where there's nothing on site. It's basically just nipa huts, in this small village. And so we started to think, how do we learn from this context, right? So it starts with a sketch, just this idea that you can actually just like sketch the roof, a rough sketch. So this is a very free form sketch. Right? It's not even about sketching any form, but it's thinking with your pen. You think with your pen as as an architect. I think that's what we push for. We think with our pen, and it allows us to become much more free form and open. It does not constrict us, because there's the certain thing about like the tyranny of numbers. And that's why we're architects and we're not engineers. We should not subscribe ourselves to this like very boxed space or frame or whatever it is, or computations or formulae that that restricts our movement as architects, restricts our movement as creatives. We have to remain as creatives, because that's how we come up with new things. That's how we create new ideas. And it so happened that it fit that this was a project done by basically these three guys here. And then before the project finished, I think it ended up being two guys because one of them died. So this whole project was finished by two guys. And it reflects, a very handcrafted, ideology. I think it's nice to have, looking back at it now, that it started with a sketch, ends with it being built by hand, nothing else. Even the materials, you can see the roof / walls, they're handmade, hand woven stuff. And so it's something, that's pretty much about the hand of the architect, the hand of its builders, and that's an intent, right? That in itself is one intent. And then another intent that we do with our projects about programming. So oftentimes when you come up with a project, I feel like you can almost design a space just by identifying program. If you're able to put space, area, volume, in the different parts of a certain program, if you can break them down, you can put them back together in a different configuration, then you can create interesting spaces. You can create interesting interactions, you can create interesting projects. So this was a project we did for Primark, and it was about reimagining what a market is, right? And so usually when you have a project like this, you end up with like segregating the market space and the shopping space, right? And so what we thought was that instead of like segregating them, what if we interspersed, the shopping space with the market space? And then we can kind of like almost create a new typology where you blend, these things together, where you don't have hard lines between each program, right? And then and all these things center around this stairway or stairwell. And so our idea was like, remember the bridge that we were talking about, the river lake, right? If you can insert program in a bridge, then the bridge becomes a hub and not just a crossing point, right? And the bridge is basically, a stairway is basically a bridge that connects two different floors. So if we can insert program into that stairway becomes now the hub of the entire mall or the entire space. So then you can come up with something different where you can get people to actually walk up and down, traversing, through this stairway instead of trying to avoid going up and down. And so that was like just trying to reconfigure what this program can be and how the program leads to design. Another idea is about diversity. One of the things we're currently exploring is that, for example, in terms of housing, why are we doing basically houses all the same and they're just basically small, medium, large? When in fact, we have so many different tribes, in our communities, right? People who like maybe gardens, people who like sports, people who like libraries, and so there's like so many different types of people, and yet we all kind of like box them into this like typical housing that's supposed to be like, with green perspectives that talk about like family, where you show the kids running around, maybe a pet or a dog. So we have to create diversity in terms of usage. This is our project in Lipa. It's the outlets at Lima. When we were looking at like, how the old city has these piazzas and plazas, how there are different types of like, alleys, throughout, different countries even. And, of course, looking at this site lying between Lipa and Malvar, we were thinking that we can come up with a diversity of like spaces, open spaces inside. So it becomes about like these different pockets, right? Different pockets. So like there are these open spaces for like, let's say a barkada, open spaces for a family, open spaces for like a couple on a date, a promenade where they can walk. But like there has to be this diversity of like different spaces. And so what we came up with was like there are actually two sides of this development. One side is more about a leisurely enjoyment, you're with your family, you're enjoying the place. The other side is your shopping. You're there to hunt for something, for a good deal, you're buying something. So then it creates kind of like two speeds, so it's a two-speed development, and you're able to come up with like a diversity. So one is more straightforward, one will have like ups and downs, will have like smaller cuts, more diverse spaces. And so yeah, so this is the outlets at Lima. And so that being said, you have form, you have function, but you also have purpose, I think. I think purpose trumps function or form. This is a project we did for Moscow. And so this was a competition to build a watchtower or a belvedere. And so we tried to tell ourselves is that why would people go up, a series of steps to go up a tower, to see a view, look at trees, and that's the function, right? But people are lazy, they don't like going up. So what if we just hung like this like big mirror and let people just stay on the ground, look up at the mirror and see the view? But it's also like a statement because, of course, Moscow or Russia is known to be an authoritarian state with not much free press. So the idea of like hanging this space there, where instead of it just talking about a surveillance society, but now it's about everyone, looking at everyone, it becomes about transparency. Right? It becomes about, so in a way it talks about Big Brother looking, but it also kind of like twists this idea about Big Brother looking from the sky into us, looking at everyone. So that it has this purpose to generate, because this was for an art festival, it has this purpose to generate thinking and challenging, ideas. So you have function, form, and purpose. But then you talk about architecture. Sometimes it's just very hard. A lot of our sites maybe are bland. So how do you come up with good architecture that you can easily present, you can explain, right? I always believe that good architecture goes through a rational process, right? You can always almost explain how it came about. You don't say, oh, this is nice because it's red and people like red. You have to be able to come up with a rational process for how it is what it is. So with the East Street project, this was in Quezon City, which is like a very banal site, open site. So we kept trying to figure out what we could do here. And one of the main constraints of this project was that there were these two heritage buildings by Locsin. And so we said, okay, if we're not supposed to touch this, can we use this to actually celebrate what we're doing, right? So we're actually trying to recreate these two heritage buildings, which you would see in the foreground, and then actually insert them into these 6 towers, and they become connecting elements. They become connecting elements that that multiply the ground plane. So they exist on different levels of the site now, connecting the different towers. And now, since these boxes are meant to be the social spaces, you're kind of like multiplying, the social connectivity that you have on a singular plane, which would be the ground level. And by allowing them to carry landscaping, to act as almost like, gardens in the sky, you're able to create a multi-layered landscape that does not just exist on the ground level. And then by, of course, trying to kind of like reimagine the fenestration and the dialogue between these boxes and the existing buildings as a reflection of them, you celebrate what's existing there. By inserting program, by creating, so we were saying that the ground space is retail experience. Some of them would be like about wellness, some of them would be about culture, recreation. And so now you're creating public spaces, in different layers, and that's how this project was meant to be. Another idea is about narrative. Okay, when you talk about narrative, we say that, I think people always say that architecture is almost like film, right? There's always a series of stories that, and of course you have different perspectives, but then there's a series of spaces that try to tell a story of how it came about. This project is for a hotel in Cebu called Magellan. So, when you do hotels in the Philippines, especially for like Cebu, Palawan, or everywhere else, you always talk about the sea, the water, right? Everything is about, the sea is beautiful, the sea is nice, and everything. But I think we can also look at more specific parts of water for this, right? So, for example, here, okay, we're talking about the sea, but we're also talking about these like, old Spanish influences, this Magellanic or Galleon trade that is very strong in our culture and identity. Right? This idea of boat building, of building with wood, how we can. This was actually what inspired the EQFs, but how we can build boats with our hands, right? So it was a very quick project. I think this was like 10 minutes, right? So we were looking at this form, we built this like model, and we're like, what if it's just like, make this into a ship, right? What if we just curve, this space, and then, try to talk about like these like large galleons, that used to ply the Mexico, Manila, or Acapulco trade. And so it's reflected underneath the ship. You would have, you would reflect the, almost like a underwater kind of like feature. Inside, you want to reflect the deck of these like galleons and ships. So, it was like, almost just like building a ship. And, like this building is clad in this hull, which is what a ship is, right? You have a skeletal frame, and then you clad it in this hull. And so that's how this project came about. So it's a story about, ocean voyages, right? About these Magellanic discoveries, if you may. Another idea we do is about collective assembly. How do you build communities? Many projects, I'm sure, not just us, when we talk about design, we always say, we're building communities. We're communities for our families, children, the future, whatever. Of course it sounds nice, right? But how do you actually build a community? Right? And then it's about collective assembly. It's about assembling, right? It's about assembling families, people, and how do you bring them together to build a community? And communities are about shared experiences, right? So when you're doing this resort project in Palawan, of course, when you do resort villas, you start to kind of think about the main focus usually is on the villa. How do we design the villa? And then you look at the site, maybe you look at how you can lay it out to make the site nice and everything. But we started to think about this like, how do we look at this as not just a resort, but actually more like a village or like a small town by the sea, if you may. So we looked at these villas and we said you can actually cluster them. right? So you can have small clusters that create, small corners. Then you can cluster these clusters to create neighborhoods. And so we started to think, how do we actually make this small town? Right? So it's about these town lanes, these pathways that go through the whole space, where you have this hierarchy. You have a main space or main road. It's like any small town, you have Main Street, where you have the bakery, where you have the bank, where you have everything. So you create a town center, right? So if you go to like any small, European town or even village, you always know where the center is because the church is there, the bake shop is there, all these like garden features are there. So you create that. You create a town center. But you augment this also. You spread this out. You create town scenes. You create these like small points of interest spread throughout this development. So it's not just a town center and then living quarters. You try to spread it out. You create these like small little scenes all over your development. And now it becomes almost like a village come to life. It's almost like, I always feel like thinking about this project that it's almost like animation. When you draw like remind of like the Beauty and the Beast. When you have like try to draw a small town, for pencil, then color, then put music, it comes to life. Right? And same way, you spread. You have to pull out these activities, these points of interest, to insert life into this town. And then you talk about town clusters, right? Because towns don't have homes arranged in grids or in lines. You have to be able to create small clusters. Right? There are neighbors, so that's why you know that these 4 guys are your neighbors and not them. So you create your own tribe. You create tribes within a city or a town. And so we thought about this concept of bakurans, right? Which also came from a project that you were submitting for another project. So it's the idea that you have this like backyard that can connect and segregate. So the idea was that if we cluster these 3 villas around this backyard, you make them one cluster. But this backyard also serves to separate, the 3 villas. So it becomes sort of like, like a community center in a way. So what you have here is you have these sheer, huts, along this bakuran. So you know that it's delineated. But then by making this a social space, you connect the 3 or 4 or maybe 5 villas together. Right. So, and then by arranging these clusters, around this like main town lane or main route, what you have now is you kind of like create. So this is the bakuran. This is the bakuran. You connect these 3 elements, connect the 3 villas. They serve as connecting and separating elements, right? And then the villas themselves, they face out. So that's the back. It's a bakuran. It's a backyard, right? It's the backyard that connects us. And so so that's how you kind of like create a small, almost like a small town or little town instead of a resort. And then another idea is about interactions. Well, this is something that we keep wanting to explore about how we can increase interaction. And that's what we did about social intimacy, remember? Is that we make public spaces or social spaces part of our daily routine instead of a destination. So when we were designing this project, it's actually a condo building in Manila. We were thinking that, a condominium is basically a vertical village, right? So when you have a village, you always have this main street. I think I love main streets. So you have this main street, and most of the points of interest, or like for example maybe the library, the school, the fire station, whatever, the gym or something, the basketball courts, they're usually arranged, around this main street. And the houses, around this like main street, they go away from that street. But then you always know, you're sort of like, okay, I live near the library, I live near the school. And that's how we used to define before we used Google Maps, right? You live near the church, you live near the garden, you live near the park. So, the concept was simply, what if we flip this vertically? And we said that, instead of like an amenity floor, what if the amenities are split throughout the building? What if they're spread out throughout the floors? And basically, you're like in that main road, which is the elevator core in a building. And every time you enter or exit, let's say you go home or you go out to work, and you will pass by this amenity, right? You see, okay, there's a small library here in the lobby, just as an example. And what this means is that the 50 floors of this building are no longer the same, right? Maybe you can have 4 floors with a garden, 5 floors with a library, 3 floors with a gym, so on and so forth. But as a buyer, now I can choose. I like reading books. Maybe I choose the floor with the library. I like meditation, so I choose the floor with a tea garden or a tea pavilion. So you can now create a certain identity for yourself in terms of where you live, in this building. And then sometimes, we just, go do our research. We try to rack our brains, but there's not much, in terms of ideas coming out. But another shortcut is space has mass, right? Different spaces have mass, and sometimes it's just about how you kind of like try to put them together, right? And so this project is about like trying to imagine because this project has like 101 functions, right? It's like there's an apartment, there's a hotel, there's an office, there's everything basically in this apartment. So what you're trying to say is that these different functions don't have the same mass. Right? So for example, let's say an apartment would be deeper than a hotel space, and so on and so forth. So when you kind of like stack them up, they would have different widths and different requirements, right? Retail would be wider, you need it to be more explorative. Office spaces would be smaller than that. But then condos would be smaller again, and then hotels would be smaller, and so on and so forth. So by stacking this up, you can now create different depths and different spaces. And what you have is kind of like an interesting form. And so this is how it came out to be. Another concept we talk about is an organizing principle. Right? So when we do a project, especially a very complex project like let's say a city hall, and sometimes we focus on the rooms. You have so many rooms inside this project or typology, and you get confused. Usually you drown. Actually, the main thing you really have to think about is what's the organizing principle. Right? For example, I would say a city hall has so many functions, so many different things. They're all just offices, right? And so the question is, there's front-facing public, there's private ones, and then there's the executives. So how do you organize them? How do you bring them together? What is the main path that people will follow when they go into this space? Then maybe, just maybe, if you can highlight, this organizing space or organizing principle, that can be your design already. I think the Catbalogan City Hall project was like that. It was just this main kind of like thoroughfare that connected everything. So all the offices, same as this one, all the offices lead towards this main path that goes throughout the entire building. And then by kind of like just highlighting it, and then that's how we came up with this design for this project. So another idea, if you don't have your internal organizing principle, is to look at external inflections. Right? The surrounding buildings, the surrounding site, the context affects us, yes, by research, by what data we can get. But it also pushes against us. There's a dialogue that you do with the surrounding buildings in a site. So when we were tasked to design what they wanted as an iconic form in BGC, we thought ourselves with this project that maybe in this forest of trees, a simple block would be more iconic, right? I mean, with all these towers and everything, if we can come up with this cubic form that everyone can draw, that would be much more memorable for everyone. And so what we did was, we tried to reimagine how we can build this fat building. And that works only by inserting a courtyard, by inserting an open, almost cavernous promenade throughout the site that allows you to bring in daylighting. But as a response to the surrounding towers also, now we've recreated what we found there on site, which is an open piece of land. And now we've created an elevated plaza, or open space, at the roof. And it's pretty wide, something that's more immediate to the buildings around it. So this was the urban block. Another way to develop architecture is by applying form or applying definition, right? Sometimes there are very strong forms, for example, that was a block, a simple block. But there is also definition, How you create definition is by trying to apply external stimuli also. I think this project is for a library competition. So, of course, the library is a building and everything. And then we started to think about it as like, a library has different spaces. It's a collection, right? A library is a collection. It's a collection of stories, different spaces. But it's also a collection because this site was the termini for different streets that end up here, So it's almost like a net in many ways. So by thinking about it this way, by breaking it up, because you wanted to have the different pathways, by looking at different spaces, different stories that can happen, you can have a lover's lane or whatever. By looking at different spaces or different events that can happen in the library, you can slowly break up this mass and create, a more defined space or program. That's what we did here. Another influence we do is about talking about, like, in one project, positive and negative space. This project is a very simplistic project. It's about creating a curvilinear tower. I know you guys are working on a version of it now. And it's about a hive, really. Initially, it was about a hive. And what was a hive here is not actually the building, but rather the opening, this piazza in the middle of this project. And this was the hive because everything goes on around it. And by creating this hive or this open space and reflecting that, in dialogue with the vertical tower, now you create an interesting, interaction inside your site or space. So this was what this project was about. And then an interesting about materiality is that I think it can help you guys, and maybe that's something that you guys can work on. It's not something I'm very interested in, but I think can help with many projects. We worked on this very weird project for a Christmas tree, actually. So it was about the ASEAN 50 event. I don't know if anyone here will work on this part. No. Yeah, this was for the ASEAN meeting here a few years back, I think. The 50th anniversary or something. And so we were designing this like Christmas tree here. And we're saying like, what would be a modern Filipino Christmas tree? Since pine trees were never really something that we Filipinos could relate to. I think I have the most pine trees in this country downstairs. But most people don't know what a pine tree is. Right? So what can be a modern Filipino Christmas tree? Based on the idea of a parol, based on our materiality with the weaves and patterns, right? And how we can actually build this. And yeah, so I don't know where this thing is now, but it was nice actually when it was there, and we fit here actually. So this was the team that built this, who are no longer here. So yeah, but it's a modern Christmas tree. So yeah, hopefully before you guys, if you guys leave the office, you guys have something like this, something that's kind of quaint. This project is about light and shadow. I think that's something that we can't explore as much in our country because we live in a tropical country with strong, stark daylight. Right? It's very heavy daylighting. But this was a project for Taiwan, and what they wanted here was, the idea was it's really about Chinese painting. And when you do watercolor painting in Chinese or rice paper, the most beautiful ones are in black and white. And it's always in shades, of black, gray, white, etc. And it's always about the mixture of water and ink, the pressure, how you apply your strokes, how they overlap. And so we wanted to recreate that in this project, this idea of like strokes, that overlay, of shadows that can be heavier or lighter, and how the building almost is not what you're talking about, but it's the strokes, it's the shadows that define the building, not the form itself. So it was about a building that was mostly, if you look at it, the way the building fades, but it's about the shadows that you create with the building. And then we talk about shape and texture. This was a project for a fishing net. Well, I don't know why there's a fishing net here. But this is a bridge that Arvin's doing. I think they're trying to use the fishing nets as a main element to highlight the bridge. We're using the PVC sheets again for this project, and shaping it in a way to kind of like remind us of like muscles or sinews, because it's a sporting facility. This was a very simple project. I think some guys they're working on. It's about using the wood, the wood patterns in the site. This one is just about making terracotta roof tiles into wall material. So simple, simple materiality changes, quirkiness. I think one gesture, one good gesture can really change, a simple, like a bland project to a simple, nice one. Then we end about the human environment. I think we've been working on social architecture for the last 5 years, more because of the pandemic. But we're shifting towards this new idea. We're trying to build about the human environment. It's evident in a lot of the projects we're working on. We're working on a lot of planning projects. And it's very challenging, I would say, because we're slowly defining the future of our country. And if we don't like many of these spaces when we retire and grow old, I think we largely have ourselves to blame then, by that time. So I want to talk about the human environment and why when we master plan spaces, we should not look at it as a sectioning exercise, not as something like where you have this top-down control, command and control process where you delineate spaces in a city. We want to talk about the people actually living in our cities, the human interactions. I think these two are our favorite images of kids, I don't know, jumping around somewhere. But when you do a master plan, you have to look at the landscape. And I was mentioning earlier, sometimes you have no landscape, but you have to build your own urban landscape, right? When you're looking at the urban form, we have canyons and ridges, we have valleys, there's even plains, if you may. So this project was largely built around, this urban valley, a valley that was kind of like formed around this like canal park, right? And it's basically a celebration of the Pasig River, how we settled as Tagalog people around the Pasig, and how do we build communities around the Pasig. And so I go back to this idea of what is a community, right? A community is a group of people with a shared experience. For example, here, this is an architectural community because we share architecture as a commonality. You might like Dungeons and Dragons, you might like flying kites or whatever, or like bird watching, and you have all these different tribes or communities, right? But what's important is that these communities have a shared experience. And that's one way to build a community. Another aspect of a community is that a community has an identity. So we are different from you because you have edges, right? Whether it's like clothing, which is like a surface thing, right? Whether it's, like tribal, what do you call them, the tribal facial, tattoos or makeup or whatever. These things differentiate us from each other. And that's why you would see in primitive tribes, they would have all this like decor on themselves, right? So edges, edges, delineation, and shared experiences build communities or create communities. That's how we form our communities. And if you look at Manila, a lot of the places are very informal actually, right? When you say Quiapo, when you say Raon, Raon, for example, is a community around electronic stuff. Baclaran is a community around the church, So you have all these like different communities, right? And they exist because there's this like very dominant common shared interest or space or public space around which this community is built. There is a strong social experience that defines that community. And if you look at it that way, then Manila is almost like a pixelation of different districts and barangays. And so we wanted to recreate that in Horizon. We wanted it to be about red is commercial, blue is residential, yellow is whatever, but rather each of them, are their own communities. We actually have 28 different communities, and the question now is how do you bring them together, right? So the master plan is about, nurturing these 28 different communities, seeing how they interact with each other, looking at vectors, at velocities, at intensities, and how together they can form a community or a city. And so the master plan is defined by these social interactions. And now I think we're trying to explore how we can make social zoning and everything. I think we want to keep, like I said, every project is an improvement over the last. And I believe that we want to keep refining what we do as community builders. But the way you do this also is by identifying each of these communities, right? For example, they can all be commercial communities if you may. Technically, they're all mixed use, but they all have their own defining features. It can be a community built around a theater, a community built around, ball courts, a community built around a market, right? But each and every one of them can be distinct. They have their own points of interest, and their architecture allows you to define, the silhouette of your community. You know when you leave your community and you're in another one because there's a distinction between each of these communities. And that's how we propose to build, a better human environment as we move forward. And that's where I end our lecture for today. So, yeah. Wait.
You want to present this?